One cannot overestimate the importance of infrastructure in Africa. Several years ago, when Norman Borlaug was here in this building, he made a comment that he worked in Africa for so many years, for decades, try to bring the Green Revolution technology to Africa, seeds, fertilizers, water. But after so many years, his conclusion is, in Africa, what you need is roads, roads, and roads. Infrastructure, infrastructure, and infrastructure. So from one of your slides, that shows that the rural areas are particularly biased. 20% of the investment of infrastructure is going to rural areas, right? But in rural sector, I think probably more than 50% or even 70% of the population lives in that sector. So I think it's really not only it's challenging because of population density in Africa, but a certain government bias is also crucial. Maximo, you have 10 minutes.
I will try to bring up some comments based on what you present and try to link to some challenges and recommendations which I think are very important right now, especially with the current financial crisis. I will give 6 comments, 6 recommendations based on what Vivian has presented and what I have read of the work she presented. The first one, which I think is something important to take into account, is that we need to look regionally in the case of Africa, especially because of what you have mentioned of the low penetration and low density, population density. That, I think, is essential and is the only way we can move towards developing the needed road development and infrastructure development for the region. Now, the issue is how you evaluate priorities here, because you need to prioritize. And something that we are working on and which I think fits very nicely with what you have shown is to include 2 components. One is the economic rate of return, which is basically the numbers you were taking based on cost of investments and potential returns, especially when you look to areas of high-value production, for example, or areas of a staple when you did analysis for irrigation. But also the poverty rate of return, because that's something important in the case of Africa and looks more to wealth creation. What this means is that basically from all the projects where you have some economic rate of return at a regional level, you can prioritize the ones that reduce poverty in a higher level than the ones that reduce poverty in a lower level. The second important thing in this regional concept is how you prioritize corridors and how you can overlap those to the development domains. And if you remember the map of Africa she did and the cellular phones, where they are focused, and also remember the map of the irrigation and where the high-value crops were, they are not compatible at all. So you have high value in the middle, and you have the telephones mostly in the borders. If you look to the roads infrastructure that they are planning to build through the SSATP plans and the investments of the corridors of roads they are planning to build, again, most of them follow the previous tracks where the mines were, and they are not looking into where there is potential of high-value production. So there is a gap there that I think is very important. So this overlaying of regional corridors with development domains, I think it's very important. It's something that is being also pushed through CADAP, and I think it's pretty consistent with your concept. And also, and the last point, and I am pretty happy that you were able to comply with this report. I remember that we discussed this a few years ago, is the need of looking to what information that is available. There is so much information on infrastructure of what has been tried before through different multilaterals and what you have now from where we can learn so much, especially in what is maintenance of roads and the programs that have been successful in terms of maintenance of roads from where we can learn. And also, in the case of Latin America, for example, there is so much we can learn from the privatization and concession process that we can bring and leapfrog in the case of Africa. The second comment, and is linked to the economic crisis, which I think for the case of Africa, it could be a challenge, but at the same time an opportunity. And the reason why is that the economic crisis will generate excess capacity, and that we know for sure. If you look to the industrial production in 2009, there is a huge fall right now, which means that everything will become cheaper. Inputs will become cheaper. So that means that your cost column will reduce. And let's hope that the benefits column remain the same. But basically, it will be cheaper to build the roads, it will be cheaper to bring the electricity, it will be cheaper to bring ICTs, and including irrigation. And the returns, therefore, for this investment will be higher. And there is a lot that if you look to the plan that they are planning in the US, Obama is basically looking to bottlenecks and doing a Keynesian approach to increase expenditure. Okay, but in the countries where we have the huge bottlenecks is Africa, and some Latin Americans, of course. Here, the bottlenecks are a little bit more difficult. You really have to fine-tune and look to areas where you can grow, like, for example, greening technology and so on and so forth. But in Africa, it's the basics. We need roads, we need electricity, we need telephones and water. So the returns to infrastructure could increase substantially because of this reduction in the cost as a consequence of the idle capacity that we will face in the following years. Now, this is pretty linked to what China did, for example, in the time of the crisis, which they start to do in all this investment in infrastructure to be able to have productive, so look into the medium and long term rather than to look into the short term. And that could be a solution, especially if we are able to change a little bit the way in which credit and loans are given by multilateral agencies. So I think that we can learn a lot from the strategy of China and not a lot from what happened in Japan, for example. When, I was here this morning, it was mentioned that somebody sitting in a building in Japan will see the same road during the crisis being rebuilt 6 times because they were trying to expand expenditure. And they just broke, rebuilt. In case of Africa, we don't need to do that. So I think that there is a huge opportunity in terms of infrastructure. The third one, and that's linked to my comment, is financing. And here, multilaterals have to play a crucial role, but they need to think regionally. They cannot think anymore country by country, especially in infrastructure. And they need to change their way of operation. I had a lot of discussions with the water people in the bank on how they calculate if they should go into and give water to a house. And they keep looking to this per capita, or per household. And basically here we have a second-degree price discrimination. You want little margins, bigger quantities. So you cannot expect to have a high rentability in one connection. You need to find ways to connect a lot of people and try to get the externality of that and try to charge that. So I think that there is a need to change the view of how we give loans. And the operational people in the bank is not country level. It's country level. It's not regional level. And that's where I think that needs to change to be able to make this possible. Of course, public-private partnerships, and I think what we have learned from Asia and India in how the private sector is starting to do small-scale projects of infrastructure, even roads, could bring a lot of ideas of how this can improve. The third point on financing is innovation to broaden and deepen markets, including niche and preferential markets, and this is linked to the idea of overlapping development domains with infrastructure corridors. My fourth comment is on complementarities, and I think this is pretty important, and I think you didn't touch too much on it. But, for example, when you look about the profitability of the cellular phones, to transfer of information, to transfer of health information, and so on and so forth, we are already assuming that there is some connectivity in terms of roads access. Because if I want to have a good information on prices, it will exponentiate my effect if I am able to better negotiate with my trader and move my product through the market. So if I have a road, that will improve a lot. So this complementarity and the concept of compacts, of infrastructure, still is missing. And I think that there is a need to do that, as well as to look to the whole value chain. So it's not only that I need the road, but I also need the electricity to be able to store, for example, the potatoes. We have a project on cellular phones, information systems, and one of the things that we learn is that because of the storage, cool storage, we gain a lot more with information we share through the cellular phones than just having the cellular phones by itself. So the value chain approach and the complementarities is important. We know that in Africa, roads and electricity are the biggest bottleneck in terms of high cost to move things, high cost to have access to electricity. And one of the major restrictions that we face on trade is not necessarily tariffs anymore. It's infrastructure. If IFPRI, Antoine and other people here, Antoine Bouet and Devesh Roy, had a paper that they look what will be the impact if we simulate different scenarios of access to infrastructure in terms of trade creation. And there is a significant return in terms of what we will gain in trade as a consequence of access to infrastructure. So there is a lot of dimensions of returns that we need to include to be able to evaluate this. Now, on the regulatory part, I think it's also important, and it's one of the major things that is phasing out. And in Latin America, when they start doing these huge programs of infrastructure development, there was a lot of innovation in terms of regulation. But if you look at now, there is a lot of problems, and it's dying, and there is a lot that we can learn from it, and we can leapfrog from it. And the idea here is how we implement regulation that increase competition, like what happened in the cellular phones, for example, and Africa is an example of that. Open to new technologies, that is pretty important, and open to new business models. So let the private sector to play, but have certain minimum rules of the game, using market forces and using minimum regulation, but appropriate, that will allow this competition. And here I link to what you have been doing in terms of what we call the market efficiency gap and the real access gap, and this fits perfectly with what you have presented. In most of the cases, you try to find ways to measure this real access gap and market efficiency gap. And what I wanted to bring here in this comment is the importance to do that difference if you really want to have subsidies. Because really, a lot of the areas, as she showed, for example, in the case of cellulars and other technologies, is not necessarily areas where you have a real access gap, whereas where you really don't have the demand to be able to give the infrastructure. Are areas where there you need to have a subsidy to be able to make it, or at least to start it in the short-term period. It could be that the subsidy will disappear over time, but the initial situation will need that. But there are a lot of areas which are areas, what you call the close to the rural, to the urban, and which could clearly be areas in which by good regulation or small changes could create the demand. And I think the cellular phones and the prepaid system, for example, is a clear result of that. People that use prepaid phones pay a lot more than people using plans. And the same thing happens with electricity. It's funny to hear companies still using traditional technology of regular meters instead of using prepaid meters. Just imagine how much time it takes to a company to go to charge to a house the consumption that they have to meter in the regular meter, and they have to go back. So if the house is 12 hours away, they have to work 12 hours just to invoice them, and then they have to work 12 hours again to disinstall the meter if they are not paying. While if they were using prepaid meters, the households are the ones which are going to come and buy the prepaid cards. So I think that there is still an inconsistency on the use of the technology, and I think there is a lot that we can learn from this. And finally, so I don't take more of your time, I think that the leapfrogging here is important. We don't need to repeat what was happening in developed countries. The cellular industry was a clear example of how we jump. The use of best technologies, the idea of the prepaid meters, and the use of green infrastructure. So not necessarily this is something that happens to the US. It could be that in this jump, in the case of Africa, we can also start moving towards green infrastructure so that we can move forward. Thank you so much.